The summer of 1945 was supposed to be their last nightmare. Women captured during the Pacific War, labeled as comfort women by their captors, had lived under terror so constant that even sleep had become a luxury. Years of abuse, whispers of shame, and the constant fear of the enemy had hardened them. They moved like shadows, quiet, careful, waiting for punishment they had been told was inevitable. Rumors had reached them even before the war ended. Those who had survived whispered among themselves about the Americans, merciless, brutal, unforgiving. Mothers clutched their daughters, warning them that honor was only preserved in death. But when the Americans finally came, the women were trembling, eyes wide, bodies stiff as boards. They expected soldiers with rifles and sneers, with rough hands and orders barked in an unfamiliar tongue. Instead, what greeted them was strange. Distance. Space. The Americans approached with caution, their rifles lowered, their eyes not hungry but attentive. Food was set down before them. Water, blankets, and small necessities placed gently by hands that refused to cross the line. At first, the women refused to believe it. Could this be some ruse, a test of obedience? Some held their children closer. Others refused to eat, afraid that to touch the offered food would mean some terrible consequence. But slowly, hesitation gave way to trust. A mother reached for the bread, a girl sipped water, and the soldiers stepped back, observing quietly. Days passed, and a strange rhythm developed. The Americans delivered necessities, never interfering with the women's movements, never touching them. The women whispered to one another in disbelief, trying to reconcile the constant teachings of fear with the reality of restraint. Could this be humanity hiding beneath the uniform, or some cruel trick of fate? Then, on a bright afternoon, a group of souls sat. Dyers approached carrying a collection of bags. One officer stepped forward, speaking through an interpreter, and announced, "For the women, something different." Confused, the women watched as boxes were carefully opened. Inside were brushes, soaps, towels, even perfumes, items for bathing, grooming, and self-care. They had been told that such things were privileges denied to them, that dignity had no place here. The women gasped. One reached for a brush and then stopped, trembling. "It's ours?" she asked, voice barely audible. The soldier nodded, stepping back immediately, giving her space. For the first time in years, the women were allowed to care for themselves without fear. Faces were washed, hair combed, skin scrubbed until the dirt of weeks faded. Children laughed as their mothers worked gently, laughter mingling with tears of relief. Days turned into a week, and still the pattern persisted. Food was distributed, clothes were cleaned, blankets replaced. But what stood out most was what came next. One morning, the women were led to a small building they had never seen before. Windows glinted in the sun, and the scent of lavender and powder drifted through the air. Inside, chairs, mirrors, and tubs waited. A small team of American women, nurses, volunteers, welcomed them politely. A beauty salon. It seemed impossible. The women froze at the entrance, unsure whether to step inside or flee. But with quiet encouragement and patient gestures, they sat. Some giggled nervously. Others cried silently. Hair was washed, cut, combed. Faces were treated, nails cleaned, and skin cared for. Mirrors reflected faces that had not been seen for months. Faces still beautiful, still human. One soldier had the courage to speak softly, "You deserve this." The simplicity of the words struck the women harder than any weapon. They had been taught that capture was dishonor, that their bodies and souls were forfeit. Yet here, in the unlikeliest of places, honor was restored in gestures both small and immense. At night, as they returned to their barracks, the women whispered amongst themselves. "Did you ever imagine kindness could feel like this?" one asked. Another replied, "It is, terrifying in its own way." The concept of mercy, of respect, of care without ulterior motive had become almost unbearable. not because it was painful, but because it challenged everything they had been taught. Letters began to appear, small scraps of paper encouraging them to write to families if they could. For some, it was the first connection to a world beyond war in years. They wrote carefully, describing the strange kindness they encountered, trying to explain that even among captors, humanity could survive. As the days went by, the women began to trust. Some helped each other with grooming, passing brushes, combs, and towels. Children played, laughing freely for the first time in ages. Mothers, once stooped with fear, began to straighten. There were no rough hands, no threats, no cruelty. Only quiet, measured gestures of care. And slowly, an impossible thought crept into their minds. Perhaps their captors were capable of something they had never believed. Empathy. The following days brought new surprises to the women. What had once been terror now began to take on a strange rhythm. Every morning, food was delivered with careful precision: rice, vegetables, fresh bread, even small portions of fruit that seemed almost luxurious after weeks of deprivation. The soldiers never demanded anything in return. They handed the items over and quietly stepped aside, their eyes averted, but attentive, ensuring no one went hungry, yet never intruding. Some of the women hesitated, unsure if taking the food would be a trap. Could this generosity be trusted? Each bite was a small act of courage, each sip of water a test of trust. And each time the soldiers held their distance, waiting, observing quietly, never crossing the invisible boundary that had been established. Soon the women began to notice patterns. Blankets were replaced, clean and neatly folded. Clothing was washed and returned, worn but tidy. Soap and water were made available, and instructions given gently for children to be bathed. The women could not understand the motivation behind such care. Was this standard procedure, or something more human? Each small act gnawed at the assumptions they had carried their whole lives, that the enemy was inherently cruel, that capture meant the loss of dignity. By the middle of the week, the most unimaginable event occurred. The women were guided to a small room set aside for personal care. Here, a team of American volunteers, mostly women, had prepared a makeshift beauty salon. Chairs, mirrors, combs, brushes, towels, and perfumes awaited them. At first they hesitated, unable to believe such attention could be meant for them. A soft-spoken nurse gestured for them to sit. Slowly, cautiously, they obeyed. Hair was washed, combed, and cut. Faces were washed and pampered, nails cleaned. Mirrors reflected faces that had gone unseen for months, faces that were still beautiful, still human. The women laughed softly, cried quietly, and in some cases trembled. The experience was almost surreal. They had expected abuse, not care. The dissonance was dizzying. Some of the women began to share small smiles with one another. They passed brushes and combs, helped each other with bathing, and slowly, cautiously, a sense of community returned. Children played in the background, their laughter tentative but growing in confidence. Mothers, who had stooped under years of fear, began to straighten. They began to whisper about hope, about possibilities, about survival beyond the war. Even small gestures had profound impact. A soldier brought an extra towel to a mother whose child had soiled his clothing. Another helped hang laundry to dry, standing at a respectful distance, giving her privacy but offering assistance when necessary. These small acts of attentiveness, repeated day after day, began to chip away at the wall of fear and mistrust. The women began to write letters again, this time not just to families but to themselves, recording their experiences, the shocking care they were receiving, the acts of mercy that seemed almost impossible. One young woman, who had once believed herself destined for shame, wrote carefully about the beauty salon, describing how a stranger had washed her hair and combed it with kindness, something she had never expected to experience. Another recorded how a soldier had quietly handed her child a piece of fruit and then stepped back, giving them space while still ensuring their needs were met. As the days turned into weeks, a rhythm of normalcy, fragile and carefully maintained, began to settle. Food at regular intervals, clean water, personal hygiene, and moments of dignity became the pillars upon which the women rebuilt themselves. The soldiers patrolled but never intruded, providing security without violating boundaries. For the first time in years, the women experienced a sense of safety that was not enforced through fear, but through consistent respect. Yet, for all the kindness, there remained a lingering doubt. Some women whispered in hushed tones, "Perhaps this is a trick. Perhaps they will demand something later." The fear of betrayal was deeply ingrained, a result of years of indoctrination and abuse. But as the days passed and the pattern of care persisted, their doubts slowly began to diminish. It became impossible to reconcile fear with reality. The Americans were not cruel, nor were they seeking to exploit the women. Their acts of mercy were genuine. One afternoon, a small group of soldiers entered the camp carrying additional supplies. Among them were towels, soaps, brushes, and even small cosmetic items, carefully packed and intended for personal use. The interpreter explained that these were for the women, to allow them to care for themselves. The women stared, incredulous, before cautiously accepting the items. Slowly, with trembling hands, they began to use them, experiencing sensations they had long forgotten: the softness of a towel, the scent of soap, the simple pleasure of grooming themselves. It was during these moments that the women began to reflect on what mercy truly meant. They had been taught to fear, to expect the worst, to assume that capture would strip them of all dignity. And yet, every act of care, every gesture of restraint, every simple kindness had begun to reshape their understanding. Mercy was not weakness. Mercy was not empty. Mercy carried power. The power to restore humanity, to challenge fear, and to instill hope in the most unlikely of places. At night, as the women lay on blankets freshly handed to them, they whispered stories to one another. They shared memories of the beauty salon, of the soldiers' respectful distance, of the fruit and water, of the letters they had written. For the first time in years, the women could speak freely of survival, not in terms of fear, but in terms of life reclaimed. The war had taken much, but these small gestures of humanity offered a glimmer of something greater, a fragile, bewildering hope. For the women of the camp, the weeks that followed became a testament to the quiet strength of kindness. Every day, acts of mercy compounded, teaching lessons that could not be forced or demanded. And slowly, they began to see their captors not as monsters, but as human beings, weary, careful, yet capable of extraordinary care. The realization was unsettling, even frightening, because it challenged every assumption they had been taught about enemies, about war, and about themselves. The following days deepened the transformation. The women began to move through the camp with cautious confidence. Children played freely, their laughter echoing off wooden barracks. Mothers carried them proudly, no longer bowing under the weight of fear. The soldiers continued their routines, distributing food, maintaining security, and offering small gestures of care, yet never crossing the invisible boundaries the women had feared for so long. One morning, a medical officer entered with 2 nurses, quietly announcing through an interpreter that they would check on the health of mothers and children. The women froze at first, their minds alert to the possibility of cruelty. But the officer knelt gently beside a coughing child, listening to her chest with a stethoscope, murmuring instructions, then handing the mother a small vial of medicine. The touch was careful, respectful, and free of any condescension. Mothers wept quietly, struggling to reconcile their fears with the reality before them. A few days later, the soldiers introduced yet another extraordinary measure. Paper, pencils, and envelopes were handed out, allowing the women to write letters to their families back in Japan. At first, the idea seemed impossible. Some women hesitated, afraid to believe such freedom could be allowed. Slowly, hands trembled as they wrote, conveying to loved ones that they were alive, safe, and cared for. The letters were collected, carefully folded, and placed into sacks to be sent through the Red Cross. The act of writing, something so simple, became profoundly liberating. It was more than communication. It was affirmation. It was proof that life continued, that dignity had not been lost, and that hope, fragile, delicate but persistent, could survive even the darkest years of war. Women who had hidden in shadows, terrified of every soldier, now lifted their eyes, speaking quietly with one another about survival, care, and humanity. As the days turned into weeks, the camp settled into a rhythm of compassion and structure. Soldiers patrolled with rifles at ease, always maintaining a respectful distance. Blankets were replaced when worn. Food and water arrived consistently. Children were treated gently, with medical care and attention that was foreign to the women's prior experiences. The acts of kindness, repeated daily, became the framework upon which the women rebuilt themselves. Evenings brought small gatherings around fires, where whispers of astonishment and disbelief were shared. One elder, Sachiko, clasped her rosary tightly and murmured that she had prayed to die rather than face capture. Now she whispered to younger women about mercy, about dignity, about a humanity that had surprised them all. They discussed their astonishment at the Salon, at the letters, at the care, each story reinforcing the improbable truth. Their captors had chosen respect over cruelty. The women began to reflect on what it meant to be human. For years they had been taught that the enemy was barbaric, lustful, and merciless. Every propaganda poster, every whispered warning, every story of cruelty had instilled terror into their minds. Yet in the quiet care of the American soldiers, they discovered something far more disorienting than violence: restraint, mercy, respect, boundaries carefully maintained, life preserved. One day, as the women prepared for a routine distribution of blankets and food, they noticed something remarkable. Soldiers were present, but their eyes were averted, allowing the women to move freely, to care for their children, and to interact with one another without interference. Small acts, like handing an extra towel or quietly clearing a child's plate, were executed with precision and thoughtfulness. The women whispered to each other in awe, realizing that even without physical intrusion, every gesture reinforced their humanity. By the time the official release orders came, the women had changed in ways deeper than appearances or routines. They had regained trust, if only cautiously. They had learned that humanity could exist even in the midst of war, and that respect could survive even the harshest circumstances. They boarded transport ships back to Japan with small bundles of belongings, blankets, letters, pieces of soap, remnants of care that had once seemed impossible. During the voyage, the women reflected quietly on their experiences. Some wept openly, overwhelmed by the contrast between what they had feared and what they had received. Others wrote in diaries or whispered to one another, describing in detail the acts of mercy and restraint that had reshaped their understanding of humanity. The realization was profound. For them, the legacy of captivity was not scars or humiliation, but the astonishing, almost unbearable gift of care and dignity preserved. Upon reaching Japan, the women returned to ruins, to shattered cities and fractured families. Yet they carried within them a story that defied expectation. They had faced fear and abuse before, but now they had witnessed mercy so profound it left them questioning everything they thought they knew about enemies, war, and themselves. They struggled to explain to others, fearing disbelief or judgment, yet their stories endured in diaries, letters, and whispered conversations passed to daughters and grandchildren. Ko, the young woman who had written the first letter home, later reflected on her experiences, recounting the shock of being treated with such care. She described the salons, the letters, the medical attention, and the small daily gestures of respect. For her, the memory of restraint was far more vivid than any horror she had anticipated. It was a lesson she would carry for the rest of her life. That mercy, even in war, could be more astonishing than cruelty. Sachiko, decades later, recounted the moment that had changed her understanding of humanity. She had prayed for death to avoid dishonor, yet the soldiers brought blankets, food, and protection without violation. The lesson was unforgettable, that respect could frighten, that mercy could shock, and that dignity could be preserved even in captivity. The war's legacy for these women was not destruction or violence, but the rare and unexpected presence of care in a world built on conflict. And so the women carried forward the memory of restraint. The letters reached families, diaries were preserved, stories were whispered, shared, and remembered. Even as Japan rebuilt and the world moved on, the echo of those days in 1945 remained. Not the violence of war, but the careful, quiet, and disorienting acts of mercy that left an indelible mark on every woman who had survived to tell the tale. For the women, the most enduring lesson was clear. In a world shaped by cruelty, humanity could survive in the smallest gestures, and sometimes the greatest shock of all was the simple preservation of dignity.